and introduce our wonderful guests today. Today, we've got Stewart B. Koyiyumptewa, Wesley Bernardini, and Greg Schachner joining us. So thank you, the three of you, for joining us today, and have a quick biography of each. Stewart Koyiyumptewa is a member of the Hopi tribe, a member of the Badger clan from Hope Villa, and he is currently the program manager of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office. Wes Bernardini is professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Redlands, and he has conducted collaborative work with the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office since 1997. And Greg Schachner is an associate professor of the Department of Anthropology and the Kotzen Institute of Archaeology at the University of California, Los Angeles, and he has worked with the Hopi Preservation Office since 2000. Well, thank you all for joining us today with your presentation on Becoming Hopi and for all your work on this publication. And I am going to go hide in the background. And again, if people have questions, please use the chat. And thank you so much for your time, gentlemen, and we'll look forward to the presentation.
My name is Stewart Bruce Koyiyumptewa. I often use Bruce as my middle name because there's two Stewart Koyiyumptewas from the village that I am from, Hope Villa, located on 3rd Mesa. And thank you for joining us today on a little bit of insight into our upcoming book titled Becoming Hopi, A History. So we'll just get right into the contents of our presentation. So the Hopi tribe is located in northeastern Arizona. I don't know if you've ever been to Flagstaff or Winslow, as you see on the map here. It's about good 90 miles from Flagstaff, about 60 miles from Winslow there. And we are surrounded by now the Navajo Reservation. Our villages consist of 12 villages located on the Colorado Plateau, at the end of the Colorado Plateau. There are 12 villages, like I said, and there's currently about 14,000 in terms of population out at Hopi, and we generally get about 12 inches of annual precipitation every year, and we'll get into that throughout our presentation, and it's more spelled out in our book. Next. The Hopi, I work for the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, which was established in 1989 by the Chairman Vernon Masias administration. And our mission is to protect our cultural resources, not only within our homeland, but outside where our clans and our ancestors have placed their footprint. When we say footprint, we are talking about archaeological villages that are no longer inhabited. We talk about trails, we talk about petroglyphs, we talk about plant and other resources, springs that we often visit. So it covers a wide variety of topics when we say footprint. And with this book, Becoming Hopi, we are generally trying to reach audiences that on both ends of normal readership, I guess. One is the Hopi audience, and two is for academic purposes. So we're trying to hit that middle ground in trying to inform Hopi people how they how they arrived and are now part of their homeland in northeastern Arizona. And the Hopi tribe and the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, we have collaborated with Wesley Bernardini from the University of Redlands and Gregson Schachner from the UCLA in California, Southern California. And we've been working on this project for quite some time, on and off. And I guess the history behind this book was when we were sitting around a table at the former director Lee Koyiyumptewa's home, just trying to think of ideas on how we can make collaborative projects beneficial to the Hopi people, because when researchers want to study subjects on Hopi, we often have them fill out an application and reasons why they want to study Hopi topics. And one of the first questions that we ask in our research protocol is that we ask them, what is your research, or how is it going to benefit the Hopi people? So I think this book is doing just that, because a lot of people, especially Hopi people, don't really know where their ancestors placed their footprint, or how they came to be part of this group of people that call themselves the Hopi people. So we'll get to that in our presentation. Next slide. So you can see here a map of at least some clans that have migrated from Mexico, what we call Mesoamerica. So in Hopi consists of two different groups of people that have come from the north, and those clans that have come from the south. And our calendar is based on these two groups of people, and the knowledge and religion and the different, I guess, things that benefit the overall community in terms of ceremony and knowledge on living in a place. So our calendar is split into the winter, or the Katina calendar, Katina ceremony, and that usually starts from December through the end of July. So that's when our Kachina friends come and visit the Hopi villages, perform songs, and kind of teach us that this ancient way of living in this landscape can still be conducted through what we have learned from our ancestors as they have come to join at this one central place. And then the other half, between July and December, is when ceremonies, the social portion of our ceremonies, such as the snake dance, the flute dance, the ladies, women's society, men's society, butterfly dance are performed from July through December. So our calendar is split in half to accommodate those clan groups that have migrated from the north, and those clan groups that have migrated from the south, to form under one banner called the Hopi Sinum, Hopi people. So when clan groups started first migrating into what our current homeland, there was already a person, a spirit or a guardian being already living there, and they were converging onto his homeland and seeking his advice on what and seeking permission on wanting to live in this current area that you see here. And he basically told them, all the clan groups as they were arriving, is that it's really up to you as clan groups. I can see into your to your heart and in your mind, and you come with a lot of ambition. And he told them, is that all I have is my bag of seeds, my planting stick, and my gourd of water. That's all my possessions. And my life way is hard, but it is bountiful and rewarding. And if you want to be a part of this landscape or this land area, you'll have to go out and place your footprint, meaning it translates into umaang kuktotani, which you see in the second bullet for. That means go out and make your footprints, make your homes out of stone, put writing on the rocks to show that you've been there, because there's going to be later in time another group of people that are going to emerge, and that way you'll leave this evidence for others people to see that that you are the first people in this area. So other clan groups did that, as you can see, all the wiggling lines, they went all over throughout the four corners. And some stories say they reached the Colorado Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and other clan journeys reached the Atlantic. So we're just focusing on this particular area, the Four Corners area in this book. And part of his instruction is you need to make this footprint in order to see if you want to be a part of my way of life. So it was kind of a test. And like I said, there's only 12 inches of rain that they got. Probably more, a little bit more back in the day, but the land is really harsh. There's no rivers through there. There's only springs. But he told them, there'll be a sign. I'll put out a sign for you to start coming back from your migrations into this one central location, which he called Tuwanasavi. The second bullet point you see there, Tuwanasavi, is the epicenter or the spiritual center of Hopi. All what is Hopi going to entail is located at that center place. I know in popular literature, it's called the center of the universe and other interpretations, but from our work, it's literally the spiritual epicenter of all that is going to be Hopi. So and that Tuwanasavi is also translated into the plaza area, which is the central core of village functions in any Hopi village. Next. So in this map, you see one version of Aboriginal boundary of Hopi people. The light colored brown that you see, and there is the current reservation. The one outside of that big is what we call Mungkapi. And if you go to the right, you'll see another island. That's a Navajo land inside the Hopi Reservation. But this is Songopavi's original boundary, and the dots that you see out on the dotted line, like Tokonavi, that's Navajo Mountain. Kawestima is Keat Seal, I believe, and then the further down is Yotse Hahaupi, meaning a trail that descends down from the Mogollon Ridge down to the southern portion of Arizona. And further, you have Bill Williams Mountain in Williams, and then up towards Grand Canyon. So these are shrine areas that were visited by Hopi men from the village of Songopavi, and this is considered their Aboriginal territory. And like I said, the plaza and is really, if you look at it in other eyes, it's really the land base of our current homeland where we sit. Next slide. So as part of my my office, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, we consult with federal agencies throughout. For instance, the National Park Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service. All of these agencies sent consulting letters on projects throughout the Southwest that may affect our footprint in the area. And currently, we've consulted with about 1,000 sites throughout the Four Corners area. And all of these sites are culturally affiliated to the Hopi people and other Pueblo tribes in New Mexico. So you can see a lot of these dots. Each of these dots are either parks service or gathering areas or springs or all of the above that we've consulted on. And as far down to Casa Grande and Tucson area, and as far up north as to, it's not pictured there, but to Price, Utah. So we cover a big variety of area in terms of consultation. Next. And we engaged in a place names project, and we were awarded a what they call a pilot project from the National Science Foundation, where we interviewed tribal members, both female and male, on places within our original Aboriginal lands, and then outside of our homeland. So you see a dot in New Mexico that's number 5, and that's looks like that's a what we call a Kiko, meaning that's an ancestral site. I believe that's Aztec National Monument in number 5. So that's just an example of the wide variety of in terms of landscape that we have inhabited throughout the Southwest, and we often consult on with federal agencies. We also recorded springs and their names in Hopi. We also recorded landform names such as the San Francisco Peaks in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is called Nuvatukyaovi, the place of the snow-capped mountain. So all of these places have Hopi names, which is another resource for our Hopi people. And what we're trying to do with this book is to provide a resource for not only those Hopi people that are living today, but those Hopi generations that are yet to come. Next slide. This map is referred to as Titsquat Tokoat, meaning the flesh of the earth. And when we say that, we were talking about all of the resources that Mother Earth provides for the Hopi people. And these are some of the areas where Hopi people had to travel to obtain these different resources as part of their culture and their religion and subsistence. So if you look at map 17 up there by Nevada, for instance, that's an area where Hopi people traveled to obtain desert tortoises in this St. George area. And we use desert tortoises in our ceremonies. And if you go further right to 21, that's obsidian source. I think it's up in the Jemez Mountains called Valles Caldera or something like that. So you can see the distances that our ancestors and us as current Hopi people living in the reservation villages still go to this day to obtain these sources. So one of our primary objections is that we argue is that when they start placing these laws into place, like these Endangered Species Act for the desert tortoise, or they make the obsidian gathering source into a national monument or park, you know, they never consulted the Hopi tribe to see how it would impact the Hopi people and their current practices in visiting these sites. So we in this particular chapter, or part of this write-up, is that we try to teach Hopi people that we travel a lot way for the different resources. I think Tony too is in the Salt River. One of the Salt River areas is where we gather Hopi tobacco today that we use in ceremony. So we go all over to gather these resources to be a part of our ceremonies. This particular slide is just showing how the Hopi people lost their land base. So in 1882, I think it was President Chester Arthur created the Hopi Reservation in this rectangle format. And you can see the outline of the Aboriginal lands, which was submitted to the Indian Claims Commission in the 1930s by the village of Sakovi. And in 1836, with the encroachment of Navajo and other native tribes into Hopi area, that area dwindled down into a land base called District 6. And there was a court fight between the US government and the Navajo Nation. And part of that court fight was to regain some of that land, or all. They tried to gain all of that land that was issued by executive order in 1882. So in 1974, that was what brought out on this lawsuit, where the court decided that because there was so many people, Navajo people, living in what was known as the Hopi Reservation, that land was split in half, and it was titled the Joint Use Area between the Navajo and Hopi people in 1974. So there was the settlement on that case in the early 2000s, and the Hopi people weren't successful in obtaining the original 1882 land base that was provided by executive order, but they received part of it. So the dark brown is the current reservation, including the island of Mungkapi located in Tuba City. And based on that lawsuit, the federal government provided funding to secure land outside of its original 1882 lands, and those we call new lands, and you see them in that light brown portions down in the southern portion of the Hopi Reservation. And we use those lands currently for cattle grazing. We have a business where we breed Angus, I think, cattle, and we sell that to the market to bring in a little bit of funding to the Hopi tribe. So next slide. So since 1989, the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office have been involved in numerous ethnographic or cultural affiliation studies throughout the National Park Service, as far down to the Berry Goldwater Air Force Range, where they do testing with their new equipment in terms of maybe tanks or fighter jets, where they shoot missiles and stuff. There's a lot of our cultural resources within that range. Also in the Yuma Proving Ground as well, where military do exercises, maneuvers, and as far north as Arches National Park, where we've done cultural affiliation studies. So we are heavily involved in these research, not only to record that for our purposes, but to, again, provide material for current and future generations of Hopi people. And some of these Hopi clans have stayed in these areas. So for instance, my clan, the Badger clan, we dwelled in Mesa Verde area in Chaco. So I'm really interested in protecting cultural resources in that area for my own benefit. But I also, as part of my position at the Hopi tribe, I have to be, keep an eye out for all of the clans out at Hopi. And I think from the last count, I think there's 36 living clans out at Hopi, and that's come down from, I think, over 100 maybe. I need to get those numbers right, but our clan groups are slowly going away. For instance, at Songopavi and throughout the Hopi Reservation, there's only one Bluebird clan member left, and once he passes on, that the clan particularly will go extinct, because there's no female head of the Bluebird clan to take that on. Next slide. So that's all I have on my end, and I'll turn it over to Greg.
Well, thanks a lot, Stewart. That was a great introduction. I thought I'd talk maybe just a little bit about what we've been doing as part of the Hopi Archaeology Project that'll sort of introduce the next two sections a little bit. We have been working, as Stewart said, for a while now on this project. It really has many different components, from archaeological field work to interviews with elders and other community members. We also involve Hopi high school interns most of the time when we're in the field. And then one of the things that we've been doing that the next two sections we'll talk about is, as Stewart talked about, a lot of the work of the Cultural Preservation Office occurs off the modern reservation. One of the things that we've also been assisting the Preservation Office with is projects on the reservation. So whether that's mapping some of the modern villages, whether that's documenting ancient sites near the villages that people know about but haven't been documented before, and then sort of providing just general assistance to the Preservation Office in their management on the reservation as well. And so typically what happens is we spend a few weeks a year out there, usually a couple trips. We haven't unfortunately been able to go for a bit, but during those trips, a lot of our field work it's entirely surface-based, it's non-destructive. So we primarily focus on archaeological survey, where we're walking on the land, identifying the locations of ancient use and also historic and recent Hopi settlement. And then much of what we do, and particularly the presentation that Wes will show you involves this, is we do a lot of detailed mapping, particularly of the larger ancient villages, sometimes with things like aerial photography from drones and balloons and kites, although we're much happier now that drones are much less finicky than the kites and the balloons were. What I'm going to talk about is sort of two of the themes that are in the book and sort of illustrate maybe a little bit some of the way the process works. So one of the big questions that archaeologists have had and lots of Hopi people have had is why Hopi? Why has that place been so important and settled for so long? Archaeological evidence suggests that people have been there for well over 10,000 years at this point, as long as archaeologists can document anywhere in North America. And farming began in that area at least 4,000 years ago, after maize came up, corn came up from Mesoamerica. And as Stewart talked about, farming is central to Hopi identity. And so you can see that quote there from one of the Hopi archaeologists that we collaborated with, Lyle Belinqua. Hopi represents a way of life, and it's really centered around farming and all the associated knowledge and ceremony that comes with that way of life. It's a central piece of Hopi identity. But as anyone who's lived in the Southwest knows and has visited Hopi in other places, Hopi, as Stewart pointed out, is quite dry, even for the Southwest, or apparently quite dry. And as an example of that, we have a quote from Clint Ami, who's from Tewa village. The ancestors of the people who are at Hopi Tewa today came from Tewa villages near Santa Fe, New Mexico, about 300 years ago. And this is his quote about when that event occurred. Our people started crying, they started arguing, and there was a great big dissatisfaction. They saw nothing green whatsoever, no water, no trees. They wanted to go back or keep going to someplace else where it would be greener. And I think that's often a question, and we had that conversation with a number of Hopi people as we were working on the book project, is why does agriculture work so well here? And we did both traditional sort of archaeological studies of agriculture, and then we did a lot of ethnographic interviews with Hopi farmers. And what is quite apparent is that it's this really sort of wonderful combination of Hopi knowledge and teachings about how to farm in this particular place. It's about Hopi values placed on hard work. And it's also about the unique properties of this place that enable Hopi agriculture to be incredibly resilient. Unlike many other parts of the Southwest where there were great population booms and bust, there's been an amazing amount of cultural continuity at Hopi and population continuity for thousands of years. Next slide, please. So one of the ways that we've talked about that, and I've introduced some of these things already, the story that Stewart told earlier about meeting the creator and being presented with a gourd, a digging stick, and a bag of seeds goes back to this original covenant, that farming is central to that covenant. And it really is part of these ideals of self-sufficiency, hard work, self-discipline, and humility. There's a lot of work that goes into farming in the traditional Hopi way, but that way that traditional farming system is set up is incredibly productive for such a difficult environment. Another quote that we have there is, our ancestors were really industrious people. They were constantly getting ready for winter. If you look at the ants, they're always gathering stuff to get ready just to survive the winter. And that's how we used to do. And part of what that means is the tasks that are involved in farming don't just occur during the farming season. Essentially year round, people are tending to those fields in different ways. You can see the photograph down on the left of a Hopi farmer maintaining the windbreaks that are in a field out in the wintertime. You can see snow on the ground there. Those windbreaks protect the sand layer that's at the top there. There's a natural sand mulch at Hopi. The entire landscape is a landscape of sand. And those windbreaks, because it's a windy area, help protect the crops, but also the field. And then the other thing they do is they capture things like snow in the winter, and so they direct moisture into the field itself. And I just have a picture of myself there. I think this is just to point out, I think for both Wes and I, that how fortunate we are to have been able to work with Hopi people for so long, and really learn things that, and unlearn things that I think we were also taught as archaeologists. For me, something that was really formative, I started working for the tribe almost 20 years ago, was working in fields, and we do that frequently. This is a photo of me 20 years ago, working in Lee Kuan-Wisama's field, one of our other co-editors who's not with us today, hoeing weeds early on in the season. And I think doing that has helped us understand how this process works. Next slide, please. This is an illustration. This is it's a photograph of a field. This field is actually still visible today. It's not farmed right now, but you can locate where it is in the landscape. It's near the village of Hotvilla, which is where Stewart is from. It's a piece of Asa, which is a dune field. So this is a sand dune. It's a big ancient sand dune, and the field itself is located in an area that's been cleared off. You can see some of the windbreaks like were in that prior black and white photograph down there on the left. And then the field itself is planted with beans, which are the tiny little plants towards the bottom, melons, which are on the upper right. You can see some rows of melons in the field, and then fruit trees. So something that is a Spanish contribution that's also an important part of agriculture today at Hopi. Most people, and certainly most farmers, would say this is not a place you could grow anything, but these are places that are incredibly productive for Hopi farms. And the way they work is the dunes help trap moisture. There's varying combinations of sediments in the dunes. They act like sponges, and so they collect moisture in the winter. That winter moisture helps plants germinate in the spring. And then the sand mulch that's there helps keep that moisture content quite high. When you go out and plant on a Hopi field, you often will dig quite deep to plant maize, so over a foot or more. Often you're digging below the sand and just to the clay layers underneath where it's wet. Even in the summer, it's wet. And that allows us to, or allows Hopi people to really tap into this moisture that's present. And these fields, we find ancient evidence of them as well. So this is a practice that has been ongoing at Hopi for well over 1,000 years and probably thousands of years. Next slide, please. This is an example of one of those places. This is a site that has the Hopi name of Dukanobi, which was occupied about 1,200 years ago. You can see on the map there, it's probably quite small, but there's that sort of squiggly area in the center, that denser area of sort of black circles. That's an area that's an ancient little pueblo that's there. And then there's another one over there on the left. The gray areas are trash areas, places where we find pottery sherds and things like that on the surface. But you'll also notice all those linear walls, and those are ancient examples of these windbreaks that are present in fields. And we can find these all over around modern Hopi and really illustrate the depth of these practices. And it's really quite sustainable as well. One of the things that's also quite interesting about Hopi agriculture is none of these areas are particularly nutrient rich, but often they're able to be farmed almost continuously with very little in terms of fallow periods or anything like that. Next slide, please. The other thing that we did is try to figure out, we looked at some modeling that archaeologists have been involved in trying to figure out where maize farming would be successful in the Southwest. And often the way that people would attempt to model that is look at tree ring sequences, so dendrochronological sequences that also give us information about annual precipitation and temperature. And using tree ring indices, which go back thousands of years, we can make a reasonably good estimate of the annual precipitation and temperature throughout most of the Southwest. and sometimes with really great spatial resolutions. And so we can often model what the temperature and precipitation would have been in individual, say 100 meter by 100 meter little patches across the entire Southwest. But a lot of that earlier modeling was based on the requirements of modern maize, which requires about 30 centimeters, about a foot of or more of rain in a given year. A lot of Hopi doesn't even get that much rain and really never has in the past. Yet that prior modeling showed that farming would have been impossible at Hopi most of the time, which is clearly wrong. We know archaeologically people have been there for thousands of years and farming for probably the last 4,000 or more. So there has to be something wrong with that model. And so one of the things we did is sort of flip the model around and try to look at places where Hopi ancestors successfully farmed to try and figure out what conditions could farming work under. When we do that, we realize that the moisture requirements for farming are much lower, probably about 25 centimeters per year. And that's that area that's marked out in green on this map. And you'll see some of the modern and important historic villages at Hopi are marked on this map. And they're located just at the edge of that environment. But in addition to that moisture layer or moisture level, they're also located in this really incredible place where you've got sandy soils that trap moisture. So even where moisture is falling, it is often present for plants in a way that's different from other places. There are springs that Stewart mentioned, which are often used for irrigation, particularly of garden crops. So there's really wonderful spring gardens around villages like Haute-Villa that are important for many crops. And then you have different kinds of fields. So there's fields like dune fields, there's fields down in the floodplains along major washes. And that mix provides this perfect location for life. I don't know if Stewart wants to come in and properly pronounce the Hopi words there for me, because I'm sure I'll butcher it. I don't know if you want to give it a try, Stewart?
The Hopi word is Qatit Suphelauta, meaning
Thanks
perfect location for life.
Thank you. And it's really this amazing combination. I mean, we sort of went through this process of trying to talk to Hopi people about how it worked, working with our modeling, and everyone had little pieces of the puzzle, but we realized it was this combination of all of these things. If you take out one of them, whether that's the way Hopi traditional farming works, the types of crops that they've developed over time, if you took out the springs, if you took out the dunes, if you took out one of these things, it probably wouldn't work. But together, all of those things create this really sustainable farming system that's allowed people to thrive, and Hopi people in particular to thrive in this area for thousands of years. So it really tells you that the system as a whole is what makes it work, as opposed to any one particular piece. And it turns out that, yes, Hopi may on the surface look like a difficult place, like that quote from Clint Ami in the beginning, but it really is a place that is in fact unique in a lot of ways. It's one of the few places that has been so continuously settled by Pueblo people for so long. And that's, you know, a hallmark to the Hopi agricultural system, the passing down of those teachings, and working with that land and making it more sustainable over time. Next slide. The other thing that we've been focusing on is a lot of the archaeological story about Hopi. And this is not Hopi people's own story, but the way that archaeologists thought about Hopi was very much focused on villages that were the larger villages that Wes will talk about in a moment, that were occupied more recently, within the last 1,000 years or so. There was really not much understanding of how people were living at Hopi, say more than 1,000 years ago. And in fact, some archaeologists thought there were very few people there. And largely that was because they simply hadn't looked, or they hadn't talked to Hopi people who would point them in the right direction. So one of the things we've done is work with Hopi people, and they pointed us towards these older communities that had not been documented by archaeologists. And also we've talked in our interviewing with Hopi elders about which parts of Hopi society today may come from this earlier time period, because there's lots of continuities in various aspects of Hopi society that harken back to even this earlier past. So I'll read you two of the quotes here again from some of our collaborators. Our early ancestors represent aspects of early Hopi culture. In that distant past, we still gain something from them, some knowledge of who we are that may not be fully remembered. And this is a quote from Lyle, who's worked with us. And it's pointing out that it's harder to remember the connections to these things that are so deep in time, but they're clearly with Hopi people today. And often visiting these places, I think, help bring forth some of those memories. And then the beginning of the fourth way of life was one of simplicity. The Motisino, the first people, whom archaeologists call basket makers, were planting, hunting, and harvesting wild plant foods. Song and social interaction were the spiritual forces that bonded these people. Their lives centered on their subsistence tasks and care of their environment. Their lifeway required cooperation and reciprocity. And this is a quote from Lee Konwisama. And talking about some of these values of simplicity and cooperation and reciprocity that really we can see in the archaeology of these earlier places. On the bottom there, you can see a 3D reconstruction of one of the settlements that we documented, these big, long, linear pueblos with pit structures, which were semi-subterranean structures there in front of them. And these are very similar to settlements that were documented in other parts of the Southwest. One of the things that the perceptions that archaeologists had about Hopi was that most settlements were quite small during these earlier time periods, which is true, but that archaeologists thought there weren't larger villages as well. And that turns out to be not true at all, that there's a number of these much larger places akin to similar places that have been found elsewhere. Next slide, please. This is an example of some of those smaller places through time. And so you can see the scale at the bottom there, that's 40 meters in length. So that's something that would be, that full scale would be about a football field in length, but really most of these settlements are quite a bit on the smaller side there, usually 1 or 2 households. And there are thousands of these scattered all over around the modern Hopi villages today. And many of these were probably the residences of 1 or 2 households. People lived in them for a generation or so. They may have moved nearby or may have moved further away over time. But you can think of the landscape as sort of buzzing with people dispersed all over the landscape. And they seem, based on what we've been finding, is that there were often central places that different communities were probably tied to. And a lot of these seem to be located on high points. And if you've ever had a chance to visit Hopi, you'll know that many of the mesas or the villages on the mesas today occupy high points, and there's a long history to that sort of occupation that's there. Next slide, please. One of those, this is just an example of one of these larger settlements, is a place that we've called megalith because it's located up on top of this really high sandstone butte. The photograph on the left maybe gives you a little sense of that. The white sandstone there, just below that is a big cliff that drops off, 100 feet or more. The site name comes from those piles of rocks. You can see some of what would have been the cap rock of the mesa. People had gathered up and stacked them. And those stacks, which are marked with stars on the map on the right, are flank either side of a trail that came up to the top of the mesa. And the stones here weigh hundreds, if not thousands of pounds. I mean, this is some serious stone moving going on. The other thing that people did at this settlement is they made those sort of arcs of stones that you can see. And what those arcs were probably places that were cleared and kept open as plazas, as Stewart talked about earlier. And then up on the very top of the mesa itself are houses and other sorts of structures. You can see here on this slide with photographs on the right, you can see some of those areas demarcated with the darker brown stones on the slick rock there, demarcating these plazas. And on the left, the photograph on the top is actually one of these probably storage features of a dome. You can imagine a domed storage feature where people would have stored corn. And then on the bottom is a similar one actually from Petrified Forest National Park. It seems like people were storing food communally at this place. There's settlements scattered all around it, those little settlements that I had talked about earlier, but people were communally storing the products of that agricultural system in this place, and probably going to this settlement itself to participate in ceremony, to share food, to really have that social connection that when you live scattered out in these smaller villages would have been more difficult. It's a place for people to gather at different points in time. I think I'm good. Now it's time for Wes.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So I want to pick up on a couple of the themes that Greg mentioned. The first being how we've estimated the population on the Hopi Mesas. So as Greg mentioned, many earlier archaeologists assumed that prior to the last 700 or 800 years, there weren't that many people up at Hopi prior to the big migrations when places like Mesa Verde emptied out, that the Hopi Mesas were only lightly populated. And so some of these large villages that we've documented that Greg just talked about show that's clearly not the case. But we also took a kind of bigger picture perspective on this and tried to collect all of the sites that had been inhabited in northeastern Arizona and track population at this regional scale. So we pulled together more than 4,000 sites, assembled the ceramics that are available from them. The pottery tells us roughly when those sites were occupied based on the style of the decoration of the ceramics. And what we found is that the Hopi Mesas have been a population center from at least the AD 600s on, one of the biggest population centers in the whole Southwest throughout much of that sequence. So there's two graphs here. The graph on the top, the line that represents our reconstructed population levels for the Hopi Mesas is this dark red one running up on the top, the really sort of tall mountain-shaped bump. And then all the other colors are other regions in northeastern Arizona. So, just at a gross level, one of the things that we take away from this exercise of reconstructing populations is just to show how massive the Hopi Mesas population was throughout really the entire occupation. And what this lower graph shows you, so the blue line is everything else outside of the Hopi Mesas above the Mogollon Rim, essentially above the middle of Arizona, compared to the red, which is the population of the Hopi Mesas. And you can see that after about the mid-1200s, there were more people living on the Hopi Mesas than there were everywhere else in Arizona combined. So that really just tells you how many people were concentrated there. Something else that these population reconstructions tell us is that population grew faster, especially after about 1000 AD, grew faster on the Hopi Mesas than could have been accounted for simply by natural population growth, by natural fertility rates of the people who were already there. What this reconstruction tells us is that starting certainly, at least in the 11 and 1200s, that there were huge numbers of people, huge numbers of immigrants flowing into the Hopi Mesas. And this is exactly what Hopi clan migration traditions tell us. So the archaeology is confirming that oral tradition history. And in fact, by the mid-1400s, probably half of the people alive on the Hopi Mesas had recently arrived there within the last generation or two. So this massive influx of immigrants from all over the Southwest. And we can see that there were probably two big pulses of migration. There was one in the 1200s when the areas right around the Hopi Mesas emptied out. So these are the famous migrations that included places like Batatacan and Quetzil to the north, places like the Mesa Verde cliff dwellings in southwestern Colorado. So in 1200s, that sort of immediate circle of people left their ancestral homes, and many of them moved to the Hopi Mesas. But then there was a second pulse in the 1400s, and that second pulse primarily involved people from central Arizona, from around Winslow in the Hamalavi Pueblos, but also farther south in the Arizona mountains, along Silver Creek, along the Verde Valley. And it's interesting to think about those two different waves of immigrants, because especially that second wave is coming from further to the south, and those are primarily areas that are associated with those southern clans that Stewart talked about at the beginning, who trace their origins back to Palatkopi. And those are the clans that brought in a lot of the non-Kachina ceremonies. And so it's the arrival of those people in the 1400s that probably led to that classic kind of two-part ceremonial calendar split between Katsina and non-Katsina ceremonies that Stewart mentioned. Okay, I'm just going to briefly talk about then the later villages here after the period of those early villages that Greg was mentioning. So across northeastern Arizona, but especially on the Hopi Mesas, we see these dramatic changes happening in the ways that people assembled themselves into settlements. So starting really, especially in the 1200s, there were some examples before, but by the 1200s, pretty much everyone was living in a large village. Initially, these were maybe only 50 or 100 rooms, but within a generation or two, these villages got massive, 800, 1,000, even 2,000 rooms, and roughly that many people. And that led to some really dramatic changes in the way that people experienced their landscape. So the village became a really important part of a person's identity. So when you meet a Hopi person today, they will often introduce themselves by giving you their name, but then their clan, and then their village. And it's probably that village aspect of identity that became important starting in the 1200s. Those villages may also have become endogamous, meaning that the marriages were concentrated within the village, which is the preferred practice in at least the early 20th century Hopi villages when ethnographers first visited them. Villages probably also started to take really important roles in controlling agricultural land, controlling springs, whereas in that earlier village period, sort of access to land was probably managed more on a household by household level and people moved around frequently. But now villages were large and essentially permanent. They tended to stay in the same place for hundreds of years. So it became important to kind of lock down control of land for their inhabitants. And around this time, somewhere in the 1200s, is probably where some of the traditional leadership roles, the village leader, the Kikmangwi, who's kind of responsible for the internal management of villages, and the external village leader, the Kaletmangwi, the war chief, probably also kind of became formal positions somewhere around this time as villages competed with each other and with other regional populations. So one of the ways that we see kind of the landscape of immigration being expressed here is in the places that people chose to put their sites. So as Greg mentioned, there's this long-standing tradition of putting Hopi villages up on high points, even back into the AD 600s. But we see this kind of transforming in the 1200s, where they tended to pick really big, prominent rock formations and kind of build almost castle-like, citadel-like style buildings around them. And Lyle Balenkwa had a really nice quote that helped us to think about what it would have been like to live on the Hopi Mesas during this time period. He said, "I think folks here would always expect someone to pop their head over the horizon and be coming this way. So I think that anticipation, that expectation of who's going to come next was always something in the back of the minds of people who were already here." So remember, the Hopi Mesas probably absorbed more people than any other part of the Southwest, certainly in the Arizona, the Western Pueblo part of the Southwest from the 1200s on. So that was really different because every other part of the Southwest, people were tending to leave. But Hopi was one of these few places that was just constantly absorbing people. And that had to be a major part of the experience of the folks who were already here. So Lee Kuan Wasioma talked to us about these villages in the 1200s starting to serve these functions as both lighthouses and watchtowers. So lighthouses in the sense that they would attract incoming people. You know, it's probably not an accident that these places were on high points right next to the edge of the cliffs, so that people arriving from the south could see the fires and smoke and hear the voices and know that there were people here. And likewise, they served as watchtowers for those existing residents, so that they knew who was coming and they could kind of take control of the situation and set the terms of admission to those potential immigrants. Something else that happened starting with these big villages in the 1200s is that pretty much every Hopi village arranged their rooms around central plazas. So this is the village of Sakovi on Second Mesa, a little bit north of Singopavi on the mesa top. And these central plazas were almost certainly the locations of big public ceremonies, like the Kachina dances that we see in modern Hopi villages. This doesn't mean this was the beginning of Katsina religion. Katsinas have been with the Hopis all the time, but now we had a group of people large enough to require these big communal gathering places. And that provided a kind of central focus for social and ceremonial life in these villages. Something else we learned by studying all of the occupation histories of these large Hopi villages, and there are about 75 of them that we've documented in a lot of detail, is that some of the things that ethnographers of Hopi who visited in the early 1900s, what they observed turns out to have been actually kind of a recent phenomenon. So for example, the current sort of conventional wisdom among outsiders has been that there are often these kind of mother-daughter colony village relationships where there's a big central village and then some smaller villages that are dependent on it. For example, like Singopavi and Sapalavi or something like that. Singopavi being the big mother village and something like Sapalavi being a smaller village where the people have to go to the mother village to participate in some of the initiation ceremonies. So that's a real phenomenon in the historic period, but we can show actually archaeologically that was probably not the case in the past, because we don't see small villages near big villages. In the past, there were only really big villages. And it's only in the historic period when immigrants from far away, like the Rio Grande, came in and set up little separate villages, or big villages started to split, like in Arrivie, into smaller villages as a result of tension from dealing with American interventions. So in the past, there probably weren't those sort of relationships. Ethnographers also documented craft specializations. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, First Mesa, for example, has been known as the pottery producing location, and other mesas were more for different kinds of basketry. But again, archaeologically, we can see that prior to Spanish contact, all the Hopi villages were making all of these objects, pottery and basketry. And it's only really as a result of the influences of the sort of tourist market that some of those specializations have emerged. Okay, and then finally, I just want to sort of give you a little taste of what else is in the book. And this gets to those two audiences that we're trying to serve with the book that Stewart mentioned, both a Hopi audience and a sort of academic audience. One of the big contributions of the book is for all of these 75 large settlements on and around the Hopi Mesas, we've assembled all the evidence that we can possibly present, which includes very detailed maps that we've made out in the field, 3D reconstructions of those settlements, examples of the pottery that you'll find, a list of the clans, the Hopi clans that are affiliated with those sites, all the previous research that's been done, the references that you might want, the time period that the village dates to based on the pottery, a listing of the pottery itself. So this is what we hope will be a sort of durable, tangible record for future generations of Hopis and non-Hopis alike to kind of understand how rich the Hopi heritage is, how deep the footprints go in this area of northeastern Arizona that where Hopi ancestors have lived. All right, I think we'll stop our formal part of the presentation there and leave some time for questions.
Thank you all very much for your presentation. It's really enlightening, and I'm going to bring on a few of our questions here. The first one came from Elaine Williams. So Elaine, if you would like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
I'm not sure it's going to work.
You're on, Elaine. We can hear you.
Oh, good. Okay. I didn't expect to have to say anything, and I never turned my video on. I may as well do that.
Well, we just have your audio.
Okay, that's fine with me. No, I'm going back to Stewart's presentation where he was talking about how they went far west to get the turtles, the tortoises, and then far to the east into New Mexico to get obsidian, I think it was, and then to the south for some plants. And I'm wondering, do they still do that? Is it an annual thing? How many people go? Do they bring things back? Just a little discussion of what that procedure generally looks like.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yes, we still perform these gatherings. Usually the process will involve making offerings, and when I say offerings, it's some sort of a prayer feather that we make, and we often spend one whole night with the prayer offerings and trying to make amends with the item that we're going to take out of it from its original context. So we just don't go out and gather. We have to prepare to take something out of its context and leave something behind, meaning the offering and the prayer feather and our offering of cornmeal. These days we have vehicles, so it takes much. It's usually a day trip or an overnight trip where we camp out there and spend the night out in the landscape, out in its original form setting. And then in the morning, we'll make our offerings and proceed to gather our what we've gone to gather. And we tend to just get what we need. That's a practice that we're trying to teach our younger generations. And either you just go out there for instance, one tortoise, if it's for yourself, or if you're going together for your nephew or your grandkids, you know, they only take one per person. We try not to sell these items. I know that's kind of a big thing now. And for instance, for the tobacco that I mentioned, they say that whatever your arms can get, you know, that's how much you are allowed to bring back with you. And for instance, for the obsidian, because of the laws and the gathering at certain national parks, we try to get permission before we come in and gather, for instance, obsidian. But a lot of people are losing that ability to make the arrow points. There's only, I think, a handful of people that I know that are still doing that. I tried it once, but it's really difficult for me. I ended up cutting myself more than making a point. But there are people who are skilled to make those kind of things. And it's usually made, primary purpose is for ceremony. So the bottom line is we just don't go out and pick, we have to give something in return. And our prayers are for it to continue to provide. When we pick, we pray that that they remain there, they regrow, and so that we can come back and pick when we need them. So that's the process. But in the old, in olden times, we used to walk, and or our ancestors, I never walked, but our ancestors used donkeys or horses to go to these areas, and oftentimes they camped out or stayed with neighboring Pueblo, our brothers and sisters when we go to the east. So we still do that. We still gather, but we go with the vehicles, our trucks and whatnot. Thank you.
Next question is for Jeff Yamauchi. Jeff, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I'm really impressed with the book that's coming out. I actually purchased it. I'm looking forward to read it. But my question is, Southwest and especially the Four Corners areas in exceptional drought, and I'm sure that in the past there was long periods of drought. What's your sense of this upcoming drought? Is it going to be the mother of all droughts, or what? Or is it going to be another just thing that happened in the past?
As you can see, I'm a farmer. I'm a rain farmer or a dry farmer, depending on how you see it. And I use dry farm because I don't irrigate my fields, and you can see the rainbow behind me. And that particular rainstorm went through my area, my cornfield, in the early morning hours. I was out there before the sun came up. But last year in particular was probably one of the not so ideal conditions in terms of rain farming or dry farming, in that when we started, the ground and the soil from the snow from the winter, and as it settled on our fields and penetrated into the soil, it was really good. So we were really excited about planting, because the moisture's good, the right conditions. And after we planted, not a single monsoon came. So we had cloud cover, we had humidity in the air, but as far as I can remember, we had slight sprinkles, but not enough to really penetrate the ground, and the ground just soaked the few raindrops that fell to the ground. And we're grateful for that. Don't get me wrong, but so we continue to farm. We thin our corn from maybe 8 shoots of plants to 5 to 4 to 3, so that there's not that competition among the corn to grow at least some ears of corn. And one of the things that is special about Hopi corn seeds is that, like Greg mentioned, we dig till we reach the moisture in the ground. Sometimes it's about a foot or more, and we cover it back up with the same soil, and our corn seeds are so adapted that it penetrates deep into the ground through these microscopic roots. So once it starts to grow, even though the rain doesn't fall and even though the moisture doesn't penetrate into the ground, those roots run deep into the ground that they are able to grow. And around July, when the monsoons come, even though rainfall doesn't hit the ground, there's moisture, humidity in the air, our plants will suck in that moisture in the air. And it has these protection mechanisms in there where in the morning, as you see in my picture, the leaves are open and they're gathering all that moisture. But as the day goes on, and if there's not a single cloud in the sky, those leaves will kind of, slowly protect itself from the sun, and the leaves will look like spears, so it's protecting itself from the harsh rays from the sun. And as the sun goes down in the evening, it'll slowly open up and drink from the sky. So last year, I was still able to harvest or eat from. Let me correct myself. I was able to bring home fresh corn to my mom and to my family. We had made some good food out of it, but being a working person, I had to go away for travel, which included a weekend. And when I returned back home the next week, elk had gotten into my field and basically went down every single row and ate up all my corn. And I was upset at first, but I also had to take note that are these creatures out there, birds, animals, all these wildlife out on Hopi aren't drinking as well. So at least, they got their nourishment through probably eating the corn, what was left, and sucking the moisture in the plants. And instead of being totally upset, because Hopi law allows you to hunt down these elk without a permit, because they destroy your field and your crop, and it's called a depredation permit, where they'll issue you a permit to take these wildlife. But I'm not a hunter, so and I'm not too fond of elk meat either. So I just prayed to them, prayed to the elk, I kind of told them, I know we're in this drought situation, and if we can join our prayers together, we won't hopefully see this kind of conditions in the future. So this year we've been getting a good amount of snowfall out at Hopi. So I'm really excited to go out into the field and start planting again, and hopefully we'll be able to unify our prayers with the animal beings, and be able to bring in clouds so that they can bless us with their moisture. So it's year to year in terms of drought. I've been planning since 2000, and there's some years or seasons where we've received good rainfall, others so not so much. But last year was when my area didn't really receive any rainfall. You look around the landscape as far as you can see, and you can see rain falling elsewhere, but just in sporadic places. But it never came to my area. So last year was probably the worst in my 20 plus years as a farmer, that I didn't see a abundant rainfall or no rainfall at all. And it's really about faith and prayer. You pray that your crops are doing well, because we see them as our children, and there's certain men folk will not drink water because the corn isn't drinking water. They won't drink water until they get home and do a ceremonial smoke for rain, and then after then they'll take some water. But it's really like I said in the beginning, of the Masa, the guardian of this area, our current homeland, he told us, it's really up to you if you want to live my way. And like I said, he only had a bag of seeds and a small gourd of water and a planting stick. So I think this is some remnant of that. You have to have faith and to prolong this the lifestyle that we're living. And through this book, we try to make evident that people have always been in this area, as Greg's quote, the perfect place for life in Hopi. Thank you.
Our next question is from Tammy Powledge. Tammy, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question. There you go.
I'm wondering about the population movement. What's the explanation for why people came to the Hopi Mesas when other areas of the Southwest were losing population? I'm wondering if this very productive form of agriculture was able to support a growing population, if that was one of the reasons.
In our Hopi traditions, I didn't touch on that. We are now in our fourth world of life, or way of life, and this concept of having three prior worlds really is about human nature, I guess, where people will take advantage of a certain group of people through religious ceremony or knowledge, and they try to treat or they treat their fellow clan members or village or community members. They start ordering them around, and so Hopi people believe that these ruling clans became so powerful that they were mistreating other people. So they were basically escaping these ruling clans at the time. Right now, the head of Hopi clans is the Bear clan, but that wasn't always the case. There was the Fire clan, there was the Snake clan, and other clans that were ruling clans throughout our history, but through their human nature, they started treating these people differently. And our four worlds date back to the time of creation. I think we're the only tribe that acknowledges that we were once part of a different continent. And it's just that migration over time and escaping that the ruling factions that ended up where we are currently in our current homeland. But as I stated, we are now part of a bigger, I guess, United States. We're surrounded by counties and other people that there's really no place to expand, and we've kind of exhausted that kind of running away from trouble sort of idea. But I know the former director, and I believe that technology and the way we're currently living is going to be the downfall of our current way of life, because there's not that many farmers out there anymore. our language is dying, and people are just don't want to, you know, grasp this idea that our guardian, the guardian spirit, laid in front of us. So I think in some sense, metaphorically, we're going to start a fifth world, and try to revitalize this Hopi way of life, using the technology and all of the things that are surrounding us in our homeland. So there's groups out there. One is particularly the permaculture. They teach people how to build with adobe and stone. They teach people how to grow a variety of vegetables outside their own homes. They help build greenhouses. So it's a new concept of living off the land, and I believe that's going to be part of the fifth world. Thank you.
All right, our next question comes from Leslie Bailey, and a couple people are asking about sort of notions of visiting Hopi and feedback on that. Leslie, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Okay. Yeah, I realize that you guys, you know, it's not your area of expertise to advise people about visiting Hopi Mesas, but I'm just wondering if from your perspective, you have any advice for people who've either been there before or have never been there before and would like to visit and learn more about the place.
Yeah, I think once we get over this COVID pandemic, we have a Hopi tribal website that you can log in to hire a tour guide. I know there's a lot of people that offer tours, and right now our main hotel and restaurant is closed too, but a lot of people make reservations at the Hopi Cultural Center. And it has a small museum, small gift shop. It has a restaurant that serves breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And we also have a newer hotel out at the Munkapi, the island reservation near Tuba City, where people stay and travel out to Hopi with a guide, and enjoy, you know, the landscape and scenery. Because we are still a living group of people, if you're fortunate to witness a kachina or one of the other ceremonies in the villages, I would recommend that you take it all in and just witness and not ask too many questions in that plaza environment, because there are young ears that haven't gone through the initiation process where they'll obtain this information. So that's probably the only advice I can give you, but we're still, the tribal government is still shut down due to the pandemic. Our COVID numbers are slowly going down, and we haven't really gone into that phase one of incorporating into the government structure. Our villages are closed. They have security guards at the entrance, just so that people aren't coming in and out, but that's really in place to stop the spread of the COVID-19 virus. So, and I pray every day that we get back to some sense of how it used to be, where visitors can come in and enjoy the food, enjoy the ceremonies, and just being there. That's all I can offer now.
And Saul Grossman, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
why were the Hopi so welcoming of migrants in your history?
We believed each of the clans that, well, first of all, they had to prove through their knowledge or either ceremony that their particular performance is a benefit to the overall people. So for instance, maybe the Water Clan has a ceremony that, you know, brings rain and snow, and the people that were, in this case, the badger, the bear, were in charge, and they're the ones that were making these decisions of who, which clans to let in based on their rituals. And because we live in a semi-arid environment, most of these skills in bringing in rain were probably weighted. For instance, if you possess that knowledge to bring in rain, then through your ceremony, then you had a place within the village structure. But there's others who simply didn't have anything to offer, or were boastful, or we call it guivi, meaning particular, you know, that they're out for themselves. They were kind of, you know, you don't belong in this village environment or structure, and they ended up becoming we believe other tribes that now inhabit the Southwest. But it's really what benefit you can bring to the overall community structure in the times when our villages were just now forming. I don't know if that answers your question, but when we talk about migrants, we're talking about clan groups that were slowly trickling into the Duwanasabi, the center place, as we mentioned earlier.
We'll take one last question here. Cindy Killian, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was curious about when you're talking about the women colony, about the post-revolt. Could you clarify is that a period of history, or what is that post-revolt? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh.
Which one of you would like to take that on?
Sure, I can talk about that. So yeah, I should have explained that. That refers to the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. So one of the most sort of dramatic moments in the last few hundred years of Pueblo history. So the Spanish had arrived in the Southwest in 1540, and starting in the 1600s had set up missions in several of the larger Hopi villages, and had also set up some larger settlements in and around the New Mexico pueblos. And for about, for several decades there in the 1600s, exploited Pueblo labor and sort of tried to stamp out a lot of traditional Pueblo religious practices, and made life really, really difficult for Pueblo people in general. And so in leading up, the few years leading up to 1680, the Pueblos in Arizona and New Mexico secretly hatched a plan to throw the Spanish out of the Southwest. And they did this all in a sort of coordinated uprising where they destroyed the Spanish missions and killed a lot of the priests and soldiers, and successfully drove the Spanish back down into what's now Mexico. And the Spanish were stayed out of the Pueblo Southwest for 12 years and didn't come back until 1692, at which point they reconquered a number of the Rio Grande Pueblos, but never did really establish a foothold back at Hopi again. So the post-revolt period refers to this very unsettled time when a lot of the eastern Rio Grande Pueblos knew the Spanish were probably coming back, or after the Spanish did come back, sort of fled their traditional villages. And so, many of them came out, many hundreds of them came out to live at Hopi for several decades in the early 1700s.
Well, thank you so much for your presentation, gentlemen, and Stewart and Greg and Wes. We wish you best of success with your new book. And we put the links to the book in the chat earlier, but it should be hopefully coming out the end of May, maybe early June, but it can be pre-ordered on the UAPress website. And there's a discount they're offering OSHA members that we put there in there for you as well. But we really appreciate you sharing this important work, and we do hope that it is there for generations to come, as you said, Stewart. And just thank you all so much for your time and energy around this project. Any parting words?
I just want to say thank you, and I hope we gave a little insight to what's coming from our book. And let us all pray for moisture, or if you are receiving abundance of moisture, go outside and blow it towards Arizona to the west, because we sure need it out here. And I thank you for joining us today. Wakwa.
Thank you all again, and thanks to everybody for coming out to the presentation from all over, our members and people from Hawaii to Florida and everywhere in between. So thank you all so much. You guys have a great week at Ollie, and be safe and be well and take care. Thank you.